Hello everyone. Today we are looking at the history of towns in medieval Europe. For details of this presentation, students may check the description box. I am Arani Saikia from the Postgraduate Department of History, Nagaon College. There were flourishing towns in the ancient world, particularly in Greece and Rome. But after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, trade with the East suffered. It resulted the decline of the busy urban trading Middle Ages. Most people in Western Europe lived in scattered communities in the countryside. Then, from the 11th century, the feudal life in Europe began to change. In the High Middle Ages, people were shifting from countryside to the newly emerging towns, resulting in development of trade. Europe was now more stable as the threat of invasions had gone and the knights were away on crusades. Improvement in agricultural practices improved harvest, resulting growth of population. Merrill K. Bennett estimated in 1954 the growth in European population from 27 million people in 700 AD to 73 million people in 1300 AD. Depending on the population, as you can see, there were five categories of medieval cities across the Europe ranging from a population of 1,000 to 200,000. The Domesday Book of 1087 included only 6 towns in its enquiry of medieval England. Cities of different parts of Europe had different causes behind their growth. In the High Middle Ages, with their economic growth, the rulers demonstrated their power by building castles. It led to the emergence of towns around castles, monasteries, and along trade routes. Castle towns were common at that time. Farmers were clearing forests and adopting better farming methods, which resulted in a surplus of crops. Farmers from the countryside exchanged their farm produce in town markets for artisan products. Because of these surpluses, not everyone had to farm to feed themselves. With the new agricultural structure of industrial farms, people from neighboring areas who had long been engaged in agriculture were now attracted to work in these towns. A major reason for the growth of towns was the revival of trade. What brought most people to towns was business, meaning trade and commerce. With trade and industry gaining significance, more big towns came to thrive. Better life in towns attracted more peasants, resulting in further growth of trade. It was a cyclic process that went on for centuries. They became important centers for artisan activities. Some other towns built their wealth on the banking industry that grew up to help people trade more easily. Many of the merchants who sold their wares in towns became permanent residents. As the merchants paid tax, the owner of the towns, generally a lord, ensured that his town was popular with merchants. Most towns had a market where food and local goods were bought and sold. As the commercial economy developed, certain towns came to prominence as seaport towns. Medieval European towns tended to grow around areas where people could easily meet, such as crossroads or rivers. Towns needed more water than villages, so a nearby river provided the water used for washing, drinking, and for the disposal of sewage. In order to ensure safety, the medieval towns were generally protected by large walls built around them. Some cities, like York and Canterbury, had thick walls. Inside the walls, there were narrow and busy streets. Visitors entered through gates. There was a square in the center of the city, and it had the most important public buildings, such as churches and the markets, serving as gathering places. Around them were dwelling houses, hospitals, and schools. At this point, I am going to share photographs of a few medieval European towns. There were two-storied houses. They were extended outward, blocking the sunlight from reaching the street. With little of indoor light, houses were often dark. Squares and streets were crowded with people, horses, carts, cats, dogs, geese, and chickens. Residents threw their garbage into nearby canals and ditches or simply out the window. All of the buildings in medieval towns were built close to one another. Naturally, most medieval towns were noisy, crowded, and smelled odd. In absence of street lights, the towns were especially dangerous at night. The towns of medieval Europe differed radically from those of Near East, Arab world, and also of Russia. These non-European towns were often far more advanced than the Europeans in technology, hygiene, and general level of civilization. At the beginning of the Middle Ages, towns were generally part of the domain of a feudal lord. As towns grew wealthier, town dwellers opposed the feudal rights and demands of lords. In towns of northern France and Italy, violence broke out to get independence of the towns. In England and parts of France, the change was most peaceful. Power gradually shifted from the feudal lords to the rising class of merchants and craftspeople. In many cities, local governments appeared as a privilege recognized by the kings. The rich families generally governed the cities, and in matters of finance, order, and justice, magistrates governed under the mayor. Free towns were often governed by a mayor and a town council. Medieval people elected bishops, popes, mayors, and members of town council. The object of medieval European town was freedom from serfdom. Many people in towns wanted to get a charter which gave them certain rights. The towns could offer shelter to anybody. Slaves could become free after staying in a town even for a year. Henry V, Emperor of Germany, therefore declared that the city air brought freedom. The towns played an important part in undermining the feudal and manorial systems. Possession of land was no longer the only way to rank and status. The capital earned through industry and trade was equally recognized. A new social and economic class began to appear in towns across Europe, the middle class. Over the centuries, they came to have a great influence in many countries. The kings relied on the middle class. In the bourgeoisie, that is the third estate, the kings found a natural ally against the feudal anarchy. The middle class paid for the maintenance of the standing army, which freed the kings from dependence on feudal military service. Without the middle class, the political development of the later Middle Ages and of the modern Europe is impossible. Towns contributed to a great extent the emergence of absolute national monarchy. Economically, the medieval towns may be regarded as a transitional structure bridging the medieval with the modern economic systems. Urbanization in medieval Europe had a direct bearing on culture. Education was given importance, and the nobles and town dwellers gradually appreciated knowledge. New ideas followed. Literacy increased in towns. From the 11th century, cathedral schools trained children to be future clergy members. Another aspect of the development of towns was the founding and expansion of universities. Oxford and Cambridge were two famous university towns in medieval Europe. St. Andrews in Scotland, Paris and Avignon in modern-day France, Erfurt and Wittenberg in modern-day Germany, Bologna and Pisa in Italy, Lisbon in Portugal, Barcelona in Spain, Krakow in Poland, and Uppsala in Sweden were other centers of education. The universities trained students in medicine, philosophy, theology, law, poetry. Educational programs were organized around the 7 liberal arts, which were divided into trivium, which included grammar, rhetoric and logic, and the quadrivium, which included arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. Church had a monopoly on the creation of music. Oral traditions were preserved for generations. Gregorian chant, which was named after Pope Saint Gregory the Great, developed during the 9th and 10th centuries. It was sung unaccompanied, usually in monophony, meaning single note at a time. We are concluding our discussion on medieval European towns with the note that emergence of the towns was intimately connected to development of trade. It was accompanied by widespread literacy. Towns brought new opportunities and had an overall contribution towards social growth. Thank you, viewers.